Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Escalation agenda. U.S. President Barack Obama has ordered the Pentagon to double the attack force and expand the target list as part of his assumed assault on Syria. Irrespective of international opinion and polls at home, the U.S. on its own is poised to carry out forced regime change in Damascus. Well, at least that's the plan. To crosstalk the war in Syria, I'm joined by my guest in Washington, Gareth Porter. He is an investigative journalist and author of the upcoming book, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. And we also have Rafif Jouejati. She is a spokesperson for the local coordinating committee in Syria and the director of the Foundation to Restore Equality in Education in Syria. All right, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Gareth, let's assume this strike happens, 60 days, 90 days. What kind of Syria does the administration intend to create?
They don't have any idea of a Syria they intend to create. I am quite sure that that is simply not on the agenda, to create a new Syria or to fundamentally alter the present balance of power within that country. They're talking about degrading certain capabilities of the Syrian government. If they are serious about doing that, of course, that means a much more fundamental commitment to getting involved in war than they have exhibited so far. So, there are obvious contradictions here in the official position of the Obama administration. On one hand, trying to emphasize the limited character of what they are planning to do, and on the other hand, claiming that somehow this will make a difference. I don't know how they can square that circle.
Okay, Rafif in Washington as well. Can you square the circle?
I'm not sure I can square the circle either, but I can tell you that the LCC's position as the largest network of nonviolent activists in Syria, our position is that we would support airstrikes if they were to fundamentally degrade the capability of the Assad regime. We have two primary goals. One is regime ouster, and the other is to put an end to the massacres that we're experiencing daily.
Okay, Rafif, how many Syrians have to be killed for that to happen by the United States?
Well, well, the question we've been asking is how many Syrians does the Assad regime need to kill before the world pays attention? We have more than 100,000 dead already, and that's only what's been verified. Our question is how much weaponry will Russia continue to supply to the Assad regime? How many Hezbollah soldiers need to come in and kill Syrians? How much Iranian equipment needs to be deployed to kill Syrians?
Are you interested in what Saudi Arabia does and what its allies do? Are you interested in the jihadists that go there? Does that interest you whatsoever?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, Peter. We are extremely concerned about the jihadists who flock to chaos, and that would be chaos perpetrated by the Assad regime. We are absolutely concerned about all the foreign agendas that have entered the fray. What we started with was a popular uprising. It was a peaceful revolution for freedom and dignity and democracy for all Syrians.
Yeah, but now it looks like the United States is going to give an air force to al-Qaeda. That's what it looks like, doesn't it?
No, I beg to differ. I believe what the United States is talking about is supporting the Free Syrian Army, which is not at all al-Qaeda. In fact, if the United States or the international community in general is to continue to be paralyzed in the face of what is happening, I think that is what gives al-Qaeda the great success.
I don't think the international community is paralyzed, Gareth. I mean, this is one of the points here. It's become a proxy war for outsiders. Jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to explore the implication that seems to me to be inherent in what Rafif has been saying, and that is that there indeed may be a downside to the U.S. Military intervention if indeed it does not accomplish what she would like it to accomplish. Is that in fact the case, that you are anxious about whether the United States might, in fact, carry out an intervention that could make matters worse?
Rafif, do you want to answer that?
Well, what we don't want is a mere slap on the wrist. Now, we understand very well that international norms are being violated when the regime carries out chemical weapons attacks. We have been documenting this, in fact, quite a bit before August 21st. But nonetheless, is the world going to allow a dictator to carry out chemical weapons attacks against civilians at will and randomly? Or is the international community going to put an end to that? Notwithstanding, what we are seeing in Syria is massive destruction, massive human rights violations
but Rafif,
across the board.
You're not actually answering my question.
And what we're seeing is daily massacres.
Gareth, would you like to ask your question in a different way to get the answer that you're interested in? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think what you're saying is that you're emphasizing one side of the answer, which is that you don't want the United States to fail to do something that would seriously affect the balance of power. But what if, in fact, that is simply not in the cards because the risks of that are too high for the Obama administration and for the United States? Would that then perhaps make the situation worse? That's the part of it that I haven't heard you answer.
Right. Well, if you had let me get to it, Gareth, I would have told you very specifically, we do not want something that is so limited that it has absolutely no impact on degrading the Assad regime's capability. We are worried about the Assad regime seeking revenge against civilian populations. We are already hearing anecdotes from average civilians saying regime soldiers are coming in saying, you want a foreign strike? Here's your foreign strike, and then shooting. So we're already seeing some acts of vengeance from regime soldiers. So yes, we are very concerned that an extremely limited strike would have the opposite desired effect.
Gareth, do you think it will be limited? Because once it gets started, these things tend to not be limited, if you know what I mean. Because Obama has his dignity and credibility, his legacy, and 10 years of American failed foreign policy in the Middle East. Go ahead.
There's no doubt that there is a real risk that the administration could get caught up in a dynamic that takes it much farther into the Syrian conflict than I think the president wants to go, or the U.S. military and the Pentagon want to go. That is certainly a risk that I think is inherent in the situation. But I do believe that the intention at this point is definitely to avoid it. And so I think that it does pose both that risk that we've just talked about and another risk, which is that the United States carries out a strike which simply provokes counter measures and, perhaps including the ones that Rafif has just talked about. That is some heavier repression, heavier strikes against that are going to fall on civilians. As well as, of course, an international dimension of escalation, which we simply at this point cannot accurately predict. It's impossible, as it always is, to predict the full consequences of the use of force by the United States military.
Rafif, would you like to reply to that? Because it seems to me the last thing that Syria needs is more violence, more outside violence, by the way.
Well, certainly the last thing Syria needs is more outside violence if it doesn't put an end to the current violence. And I know that's a bit of a circular argument, but what we are seeing is that the Assad regime will not step down willingly. The Assad regime will not negotiate itself out of the job.
Why would it step down? Why would it step down now? Does it logically make any sense?
We have been asking. Peter, would you like me to answer the question?
Go right ahead.
We have been asking for the regime to step down for 2.5 years.
Why should
There have been multiple international initiatives designed to lead to some sort of a negotiation or a transitional process, and none of them have been successful because the regime has not complied with any of the tenets put forth by people like Kofi Annan or Lakhdar Brahimi.
Or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. Okay, also. They don't want any kind of negotiating.
Or Qatar. What we are seeing, and I'm here, Peter, I'm here to represent the local coordination committees and the Syrian people, not Saudi Arabia, not Qatar, not Russia, not the United States.
I'm just here. I'm simply against war. I'm just against war. That's all.
What?
Okay. I'm just against war.
You are against war, and so I would like to hear your views about a despot who launches chemical weapons and Scud missiles against his own people.
Well, first of all, where is your evidence of that? What is your evidence? What is your evidence besides Barack Obama and CNN? Where's your evidence? Go ahead, Gareth, jump in. Go ahead, Gareth, jump in.
So you're going to ask me a question, but not let me answer it.
I'm going to let the other guest speak. Go ahead. Gareth.
Okay, I'd like to just pose this problem that we are looking at in Syria in light of historical precedents. I'm old enough to remember Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is a case where you had a regime that was in power, supported by foreign forces, i.e. the United States, for decades, had built up a very formidable military apparatus, military machine, very much modernized, trained by the United States and so forth. And yet it was impossible to get rid of that regime except through a process of combined military force by another regime in the same country, that is Vietnam, plus a negotiated settlement. And so I simply want to point out that the reality is that it is not realistic to expect regime change to bring down this regime in the absence of overwhelming military force from outside, which of course I know Rafif would like to see, or a long-term process that involves negotiations, a political settlement, and political evolution.
All right, on that point, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Obama's plans for Syria. Stay with our team. Okay, Rafif, if I can go to you in Washington again. When you look back over the last 10 years of American foreign policy in the Middle East, why do you think it'll be different and better for Syria with a military intervention? What's different this time?
I'm not saying it would be better or different. What I am trying to explain is that the Syrian people for the last 2.5 years have been subjected to the worst humanitarian crisis the world has known. We are subjected to daily shelling, Scud missile attacks, barrel bomb attacks. And what we are saying is that the international community has thus far been paralyzed in its inability to bring about any sort of negotiation. We finally feel that perhaps a military strike is the answer. And what we have seen when President Obama began discussing the possibility of a military strike, we saw more than 400 defections across Syria in a single day. The best hope here would be that we would see so many defections that the regime would collapse from within. This would be the best possible outcome. I want to stress that as the representative of an organization committed to nonviolence, we do not support war either. But what we are seeing is that this dictator will not go except by force.
Okay. Gareth, let's say Assad is assassinated, he leaves, unlikely. What replaces him? I mean, everything's just going to be a Jeffersonian democracy and everything will be fine in Syria?
Well, of course, this is one of the major problems with Western, U.S. in particular, intervention in the war in Syria, that you have not just a sort of clear-cut struggle between the Assad regime and the people who began resistance to the Assad regime in 2010, but rather you have a three-sided struggle. I mean, it's becoming clearer all the time. I agree with that. I know Rafif has pointed that out. But the implications of that, of course, are very significant, because it means that if you do attempt to try to use military force from outside to overthrow the present regime, you are going to set up a situation where there will be a civil war in which the jihadists have a very, very strong hand, arguably a stronger hand today than the non-jihadist resistance to Assad. And so this is obviously a factor in the thinking of the Obama administration. That's one of the reasons, not the only one, why they are committed to a very limited strike. And by the way, why the President of the United States, in an unprecedented statement, some days ago, I can't remember whether it was 10 days ago or so, made a plea to the American public that said, you know, there are downsides to the use of force by the United States in this situation. I cannot recall in my entire memory of U.S. foreign policy and military policy a president of the United States telling the American people there are downsides to the use of force. That is a very strong indication of just how serious the problems are with using military force in the eyes of the very people now who are intending to carry them out.
Okay. Rafif, what about these jihadists here? Do they represent you? Will they represent you in the new Syria after the bombing ends?
Absolutely not. All you need to do is look at the footage the LCC has provided of the massive protests of people going out against the jihadists, decrying the replacement of one dictator with another. Ordinary civilians who have lost everything, by the way, to regime bombing and shelling are going out in protest.
Okay, Gareth, let's talk about these jihadists here. I mean, in this type of civil war, they appear to be the strongest group, and the strongest group at the end gets determined the outcome after hostilities end. I mean, how do you deal with them? Are they going to go to the negotiating table?
Well, I don't think that any of the outside powers, by that I mean the United States and Russia, are in favor of that. Certainly, we know the United States and Russia are not in favor of that. I think that the Saudis are somewhat less clear-cut in their view on this, obviously, and the problem is clearly on the part of the major factors in this situation, the major outside powers, that they do not want that to happen, and I think that is why there is a degree of agreement here between the United States and Russia that whatever happens must be short of assisting the jihadists in gaining a foothold or expanding their foothold and being able to be the primary arbiter of power in Syria.
I agree with you, because that's been Russia's major issue during all this. Rafif, you know, a cynic would say, and I look at the array of forces in the United States supporting military intervention, and it's all about Iran. It's not about Syria. It's not about the Syrian people. It's not about democracy. It's just a great way to get to Tehran. And this is, you have to destroy Syria to do it. And this is, you can make this argument. You may not agree with me.
I'm not going to make the argument, and in fact, I'm going to go back to your earlier question: will the Islamists represent me? And I can say absolutely not. This is why thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are protesting in Syria against the replacement of one dictatorship with another. And so the foreign jihadists, of course, don't have a voice in a future Syria. And no, we're not going to transition overnight into a beautiful democracy. We will have a messy transition, but ultimately, it is the will of the more than 20 million Syrian people that must be done. And they have spoken, they have said they want regime change, and they want a transition to a democracy that is bound by the rule of law, in which our government leaders are accountable and responsible.
Well, all right.
So this is where
Rafif,
this is how I see representation.
I think we would all agree it's a civil war going on in Syria, so not everybody agrees on that. Gareth, can you address the Iranian issue? Because this is what a cynic would say this is just a strategy to get to Iran.
No question about it. The administration, the Obama administration, is motivated in part by the idea of counterbalancing Iranian influence in the region. And I would say an even more important element in that consideration is that our allies, both in the region and outside the region, that is Britain and France, are strongly committed to this anti-Iran strategy. And so the United States, almost as a knee-jerk automatic reaction, you know, aligns itself with allies who are taking this position against Iran. Now, there's another factor which, you know, I don't want to overemphasize, but I think it is in the background, that the U.S. national security state has long had, for decades, has had their own stake in having Iran as an adversary. It's good for the bottom line. It means that they have a justification for continued high levels of congressional appropriations. So I think that's part of the problem as well. But I do think the more immediate issue is the Obama administration sort of cleaving to an international coalition of forces who are aligned against Iran. And it's almost an unthinking policy of continuing to maintain that alignment regardless of what the consequences are. And I think part of the consequences are making it absolutely certain that the Sunni-Shia war in the Middle East will continue to get worse and will spread to Lebanon as well as in the places where it already has become very serious.
Rafif, can you speak to that? Because again, you have
Peter,
Syria
I'd like
is
to
being
jump in on this.
It's the epicenter of this conflict that Gareth just talked about. It has nothing to do with Syria per se. Go ahead.
I would like to say that the Sunni-Shia divide and the Sunni-Alawi divide is something that really is a fabrication, and I am so sorry that Gareth is parroting the regime's narrative. You know, Syrians have lived together for centuries. Syria is a melting pot of cultures and religions and ethnicities, and this whole issue of a sectarian divide has been part of the regime's platform and the regime's narrative. It's unfortunate that you're buying into it over here. Now, no nation acts unless it's in its own national interest. So the United States is certainly no more guilty than, say, Russia. And I would like to pose the question, why does Russia continue to supply weapons to the
because it's not illegal.
That has
it's
killed more than
it's not
100,000
illegal under
people?
international law. Those contracts are valid. Sending weapons to rebels is illegal under international law.
Are valid, but
I'd like to
Russian
respond.
government,
Okay, Gareth.
government,
We're almost out of time. Gareth, go ahead. Go ahead, Gareth. Go ahead.
I'd like to respond to the point that was just made about Sunni Shia in Syria. It may well be that that is not a serious problem within Syria per se. I'm not so sure that it's not a problem, but let me pose the additional issue here of the outside forces who have come in and indeed have made Sunni-Shia tension the primary issue. And you know, you have al-Nusra people going in in the north and carrying out massacres of people who are Sunnis who support the Assad
or
regime,
even Christians,
as well as people who are not Sunni.
Christians are being slaughtered too by these
Christians, people. And so you have
Christians are being slaughtered by the regime, by the way.
Position.
Okay. Well, Gareth brings up a good point. I mean, you say this is the regime narrative, but Saudi Arabia takes it quite seriously, the sectarian difference, doesn't it?
But again, you keep bringing back Saudi Arabia. I'm interested in what the regime is doing to its own people. The Islamists and the extremists are still in the minority, by the way, and that is in part because the Syrian people are rejecting them. But I would like to go back to the point. At what point does Russia feel that it bears some moral responsibility for the deaths of more than 100,000, for the destruction of about 80% of the nation's infrastructure?
Russia's primary aim is not to see the destruction of the Syrian state. Full stop and following international law.
So
that's it. But Barack Obama may destroy the country in the process. I've run out of time.
Peter,
I want to thank my guests today in Washington, and thanks our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.